everybody. It's lovely to see you today. Thank you for being on the call, those who are here, and for watching if you're not live today. That is not a problem at all. I am going to be talking today about, if I can increase my screen, I'm going to be talking today about poetry. I know that thing that thrills you all beyond belief. But hopefully after today, you will feel like you can approach any poem, write an essay on it, even if you don't really understand the poem. So that's my little trick for you. Now, obviously, we want you to understand it if you can, but it doesn't mean that you don't have to like completely get it in order to be able to write a grade 9 answer, which is always good. So, not that we're looking just for grade 9s, we're just looking for, you know, the highest marks we can possibly get for each individual, and all of this is going to help you. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. Share screen. Let's go. Let me think. I'm going to go to the essay plan. So this is my essay plan, right? Now, for now, I'm going to ask you to kind of ignore that. That for a second. Right. So this is what I want you to be thinking about. Okay. So I've got a little system. You know what I'm like with my systems. So just like we have for our essays, we have 1, 2, 3 PEE of our template that we've been talking about in previous lessons. For literature, for poetry, is ever so slightly different. It's more like a list. Okay, we're still going to use a similar template in a moment, but the first thing I want you to do when it comes to your unseen poetry, I know that fills you with dread, as it does most people. The first thing I want you to be doing is listing these things. Okay, so the very first thing you are going to do when you see your unseen poem is not read it. You're going to read the title, okay? So you're going to look at the title and you're going to brainstorm it, okay? Poetry is different to prose in a lot of ways, obviously. One of the main things, or one of the obvious things, is the fact that it has a title. Now, yes, books and novels have a title, and sometimes chapters have a title, but each page doesn't have a title, usually. So if you're having a title for the poem, this is going to be similar to a title for a book. It's trying to lead you somewhere. It's trying to give you a hint. The poet is trying to tell you something with that. And what's brilliant about Unseen and what is going to help you is, I'm sure you've heard the phrase before, oh, well, there's no right answer for English. If that was true, everyone would get 9s. So that's not true. However, there are some elements of it where there isn't a correct answer because it's asking for your opinion, okay? Or it's asking for the effect on you as an individual rather than you collectively as one of the readers. So when you are coming to your unseen poetry, this is about how it affects you, and always how the writer has come to make the decision to write the poem and why they're using the things they're doing to have that effect on you, okay? So when you brainstorm the title, you are giving your first impressions on what they are trying to lead you to. Okay. So the first thing you're going to do is brainstorm your title. I'm going to go through the list and then I'm going to do like an example with a past paper. Okay. The second thing you are going to do, let's enlarge this. You're going to brainstorm the title. The second thing you're going to do is read it twice, but specifically honouring the punctuation. I'm going to put and spacing actually, because that's very specific. So with poetry, obviously you can have things like indentations, you can have longer spaces between each line. They are all there for a reason. They have been selected very carefully. Every letter, every word, every tiny piece of punctuation, every time they change to go on to the next line, every time they change to the next stanza, everything is very calculated. It is there for a reason. Now, we never know for a fact what that reason is from the writer because we don't get to interview them, and that's not really the point of the paper. But what we do get to do is have an idea or have an educated guess based on the evidence in front of us as to what the poet is trying to do. And with all your writing, I always say this to my students, you want to think of yourself as a bit of a lawyer. Yeah. So you're going into the courtroom or exam and you're saying, I think this. Okay. This is my point. I think this, as in, I think John Jemima murdered Karen Belugi. I don't know what these names are. That's my point. I think that he did it. Here's my evidence. If you would consult evidence number AQ1, whatever. Yeah, here's my evidence. It doesn't stop there. We always have that explanation, the story, the thesis, the theory behind why the lawyer has come to the conclusion that that person with this evidence gives this impression. So that's the part that's important that a lot of people leave out. That's that evidence bit, the third row that's in your template for any essay, okay, that we've discussed earlier. So when it comes to your unseen poetry, you basically want to be making sure that you're making your point, just like in any of your essays, you're giving your evidence, so you're supporting evidence, and then that you're discussing the analysis of it. You're giving your opinion on why you've come to that decision, what you think the author's trying to do, you know, all of your reasoning, all of your explanations, okay? So when it comes to your spacing, you can use that as part of your justification for certain things. So for example, if there's an indentation, when you're reading it through, you want to make sure that you leave that gap of time to see how it makes you feel. Because if it's, for example, a romance poetry, and for example, the 4th or the 7th or the 21st line has an indentation where there's a gap between the start of every other line and where this particular line starts, there's a reason that the author wants you to wait. Is it to make you feel uncomfortable? Is it to give it a bit of space? Is it to make you think on what they've just said? You know, what's the reasoning? So you can use anything, you can say anything as long as you can back it up. Okay. So that's why it's really important to honor the punctuation and the spacing. Okay. You're not going to write anything about that necessarily. You might, but you're just going to read it twice, honoring the punctuation and the spacing, making a real point of noticing it. Okay. The third thing you are going to do is you are going to circle the verbs. Circle the verbs or vocab. If you suddenly get caught up and you're like, oh my goodness, I always forget which is the verb, which is the noun, which is the adjective, which is the adverb, blah, and you get jargon in your head going, don't worry about it. It's just words. Okay. It's just words. So my suggestion is that you look at the verbs first, circle them or underline them, because what this will do is this will give you an indication as to the tone of the poem straight away. So even if you don't understand what it's on about, you get an idea of whether it's positive or negative at the very, very basic level. Okay. It's going to give you an idea of where you're going with what you're going to say with your points. Okay. After you've done that, you're going to answer, what does it look like? Now, these don't have to be in this order, so don't stress about that. And I think actually on the plan, I might have even written above here, I might have actually written this in a different order. It doesn't really matter. As long as you address each one, it's absolutely fine. I would just make sure you always start with a brainstorm and then reading, and then the other ones can, these middle ones can come in any order really. So what does it look like? Stanzas? How many? How many lines per stanza? Any patterns? Any rhyming? Really, that's really obvious, etc., etc. But more about what does it look like? Okay, so if you can say, well, you know, without even thinking about what it's talking about, there are 4 lines, then there's 3 lines, then there's 12 lines. So what does that tell me? Well, it's a bit unpredictable. So the biggest thing about this part is to understand a poem and what its primary and basic objective is. A good way of doing that is when you see what it looks like, is there anything predictable about it? So if, for example, you've got a poem that is, off the top of my head, 4 stanzas, each stanza has 5 lines, and each line number 1 in each stanza is a certain length, and each line number 2 in each stanza is the same length, and each line number 3 in each stanza is the same length. And there's also a rhyming pattern, A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, you know, and that tells me that it's predictable. I know what's coming. I could probably, if there was going to be another verse added, I could probably write a similar thing in the style of that quite easily. So it's predictable, which makes me feel safe as a reader. Or it shows that it's monotonous and it's continuing the same way all the time, boring. It could be that it's instructional or that it's functional, so it's actually telling you something to do, it's giving you instructions on how to do something. Or it could be that it's just trying to make you feel safe, it's trying to make it predictable, it's trying to make it mundane. They're the 3 main reasons why it would be the same. Okay, on the contrast of that, or in contrast of that, what a poem that has different lengths of stanzas, different numbers of lines in each stanza, different sentence lengths, no real patterns of rhyming, that usually is to indicate that we're meant to feel a bit anxious, maybe a bit unnerved, it's unpredictable, or it's a bit of a mess, or it's very exciting, it's very big emotion, so we're a bit like, our brain's like it's going here, there and everywhere. It's an indication that there's no safety or predictability. Okay, so they're the 2 main things about how it looks like. It gives you an idea of what kind of tone, again, I guess, is giving off straight away. So just by looking at the verbs and the vocab and what it looks like, we've already talked about a lot of the techniques that are in the poem without even realizing, and we've not even honed in on what the poem's about yet. So the next thing we're going to talk about, so what does it look like? Circle the verbs, read it twice, brainstorm, write. So what's my next one? So we've got to what does it look like? Now we're going to look at the obvious. So now we go, when it gets to point 5, we start looking at all the stuff we do for our other essays. So we look at language techniques. Okay. With poetry, I would suggest that you first of all look at enjambment and caesura, mainly because these are 2 language techniques that are only used or identified in poetry as opposed to prose. So this shows that you know something different to what you knew when you were writing your literature on your drama and your novels or novellas. Okay, so immediately, as soon as it goes to language techniques, I would urge you to do enjambment and caesura. If you don't know what these are, I've got a few little tricks. Now, you know my tricks are a bit weird and convoluted, so I hope these help. But if they don't, abandon them. Just language techniques, go straight to metaphors, similes, alliteration. You can do all of that, no problem. That is just as viable. But enjambment and caesura, if I can say them, are they just highlight that you really know what you're talking about. So enjambment, jambe in French means leg. Okay, it also means a few other things. They like to have different meanings for one word, which is not very useful, but then we're just as bad. But the word jambe, this one in the middle, means leg. So what I want you to do is, as soon as you see a poem that has no punctuation at the end of the line, I want you to imagine a French can-can dancer's leg, a French leg, okay? And what that's going to mean is you can identify where there is no punctuation at the end of the line. What does that mean? Why has the author, why has the poet done that? It's usually because they're trying to explain a longer or more in-depth idea. It could be that they are trying to highlight that particular line for a reason. there are many different reasons, but it depends on the poem. But enjambment basically means that you're going all the way across onto the next line without any punctuation. So if you see a poem, just to remind you, if you see a poem that has a line with no punctuation in at the end, particularly, put a can-can dancer's leg in your mind, put it there. That's where your enjambment is. And they've done that to create or explain a longer or deeper idea, usually. Caesura is the opposite. Caesura comes from the word Caesar or Caesarean section. That's how he was born, as we know from Macbeth. So caesura, actually I've misspelled that. Caesura is where you have a piece of punctuation in the middle of a line. Okay, so this is where they've made you stop where you wouldn't normally stop. Why have they done that? Okay, so always why have they done it? It's not enough to just identify they've done it. There'd be a reason. Okay, so enjambment, French can leg at the end, if there's no other punctuation, means it's going across. Caesura is the opposite. It's where they stop the line with punctuation in the middle of a line. For some reason, they want to stop it. It's usually that they're trying to be more punchy or more, don't use that word in your essay, by the way. So they're trying to be more emphatic about a point. They're emphasizing that emphatic to make their point. It could be to physically make you think about stopping. It could be to make you reflect on the word just before that piece of punctuation. So if it's a comma and there's a word just before it, it might be to make you stop and sort of like contemplate that for a second. Just, you can say anything you want as long as you can back it up. So enjambment and caesura, and then of course crack on with your metaphors and similes and alliteration, repetition. Yeah, any of those. You don't have to write all of them. You'll be there all day. You know, what if you get like what's that one, the La Belle Dame song, can't remember the title of it, but that one, you know the one I mean. Then, you know, if you've got that, then it's you know, that's epic. You couldn't write down every single language technique in that. 3 is more than enough. If there's enjambment, put it in. If there's caesura, put it in. If there's a metaphor, a simile, alliteration, whatever, put it in. But 3 or 4 is more than enough. Pick the ones that are going to support the point that you're making. So if the question, for example, is about how conflict is presented, and you're saying conflict is presented by the poet to make us feel uneasy and frightened, and they have a metaphor that they're feeling fear like the knife to the gut, I don't know, I'm making this up, then that would support your point to choose that one. If the simile is about how the sky was a sheet of fireflies, then, or like a sheet of the fireflies, it's a simile, not a metaphor, that's not supporting your point. So although it is a language technique, and yes, well done, you've noticed it, it doesn't support your points. You don't need it, and you get the points for your support, your supporting comments, your evidence. You get the points for that being relevant to your point. Yeah, so just like I said about going into a courtroom and saying, I think this, here is my evidence, and I've come to this conclusion because if this evidence is here, this makes me think blah 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 blah, and that is what proves that this my thesis, my theory is correct. Okay, whereas if the lawyer came in and said, so say they came in and said, right, I believe John murdered, what was her name, Karen, I think I said, I believe John murdered Karen. My evidence is that he had a gun next to his bedside table. And although I know my thesis is, I know this is circumstantial, but there was no other gun in the house. There was no forced sign of entry. And there was, yeah, it had to be him. Okay. So I'm using all of my evidence to back up my answer. If I then came into the courtroom and said, I believe John killed Karen. I think this because he has murder weapons. In the past, he's had murder weapons, and other friends of his have had murder weapons. And these murder weapons, they look a bit like flowers. Okay. Lovely, but what's that got to do with anything? And it's exactly the same thing. If you use a language technique, even if it's a language technique, you can identify if it doesn't support your point, it doesn't add any points. So it's taking up time for you to write about that's not going to get you anywhere. And if anything, it might even knock you down a bit because you're not using relevant points. Okay. So language techniques 6. So this one is going to be, let me just remind myself because I've talked so much. I have to make sure I'm doing the right one. Where's it gone? Oh, it's here. I'm an idiot. What did it look like? Oh, yeah, that's right. So effects. That's right. The effects on you personally. Now, of course, every single one of these that you actually write about, so these will be the ones you probably end up actually writing about. These are more for understanding, extra things to write if you're really stuck, that kind of thing. But these are the ones you're definitely going to be writing about. After all of these, you must put about the effect the poet is trying to have on the reader. What is their objective? Why have they bothered to do it? And what is the effect they're creating? Okay. By the time it gets to 6, just like in the conclusion of all of your essays, you want to give, particularly with your poetry, you want to give your personal opinion. How has it affected you? Okay. And then finally, you're going to do how successful do you think the poet was in their objective? Okay. Link to answer question. Okay. I'll try and spell my words correctly. In there. Right. So how successful do you think the poet was in their objective? Linked to the answer of the question. Okay. So this means that you're saying, for example, if the question is about how does the poet present war? How does the poet present conflict when they are in their poem? Blah 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 blah. Whatever it is. Okay. You can then say at the very end, just to round it off, you've given a lovely critique on all these different things you've identified and used to make a point on what you think it's about and what it's doing and how it's trying to make us feel. But then finally, you're going to say, well, the effect it had on me is it made me feel X, Y, and Z. And then you're going to say, I believe that the author or the poet was extremely successful in their presentation of conflict in their poem choices or shoulders or whatever the poem's name is. And why? So I think they're really successful in presenting conflict because they've used a variety of techniques, each of which will appeal to different people from different backgrounds, but create similar feelings of distress, unrest, and anxiety. I would be interested in reading some more poetry from this particular poet on a different subject, or I didn't feel they were very successful in this, although they did use X, Y, and Z, which you've commented on. So they did use different stanzas and different, they use caesura and they use language techniques and they use vocabulary. However, I felt that they could have perhaps used the structure a little bit more effectively by making it a bit more unnerving. You know, you can absolutely be critical about it. If you're not sure what to write, just say they did a good job. Yeah. So I feel that the poet, I personally feel that the poet was really successful in how they presented conflict in their poem, blah, 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 because it made me feel the things that it made me feel unnerved and anxious, which I feel was their objective. Lovely little end and round off to the end of your essay. So how do we put this into a proper structured essay? Because remember, you get marked on structure. Here's one I made earlier. Da, 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 da. Right. So basically, we're taking these 7 points here and we're putting them into our old faithful essay template. So your introduction, you're going to give your first impressions of the poem or poems. Okay. So you're going to brainstorm the title. So on first impression, when I look at the title of this poem, it makes me think of blah, 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 blah. Okay. You're then going to read it twice. You don't necessarily have to write anything about that. Then you're going to look at what it looks like. So you talk about your stanzas. How many stanzas? How many lines per stanza? Is it predictable or is it not predictable? And what does that mean? So you're going to put, what does it look like? So make your point. There are 4 stanzas. This makes it look predictable. Give your evidence. Stanzas 1 to 4 all have 4 lines and a rhyming scheme. The effect. This predictability makes us feel as this predictability, I feel, or I believe, or perhaps, remember you want to be tentative, don't say it's a fact when it's your opinion. So I believe that this could be the author or poet trying to make us feel safe and secure, which indicates a feeling of predictability in the subject of the poem, which is indicated by its structure. So you're saying that the meaning of the poem is supported by the fact that the way it's presented in its stanzas and its form is going to help back that up. Okay. Then you might say something about how the background of the poet, if you know that, just 1 or 2 sentences about their background and how it links to that. So this could indicate that the author, as we know, was born in 1957, or this poem was published in 1960 or 1970 or whenever, and at a time of severe unrest. So the predictability of the subject of this shows a contrast to what was happening in the country at the time, and maybe what the society was craving. Yes, you're given an idea of what it's about. Then you've got your verbs and vocab. So your point is that they are using which words, which verbs and vocab to present conflict in their poem. Where's your evidence? So give us some verbs and vocab, remembering to embed your quotes. So to do that, it's basically writing a sentence, putting your quote in the sentence so that it makes sense. But if you removed the speech marks and gave it to someone who didn't know it, they wouldn't be able to identify which word or words were the quotes. It just looks like a normal sentence. That's a true embedding of a quote successfully in a sentence. Okay. And then again, explain the effects on the reader, why the poet is bothering to do that and what they're trying to do, and if there is any social or historical context to that. Then we go on to our language techniques, identify them, but remember, once you've given your evidence, you want to explain why. Why is the poet bothered to put caesura and enjambment in? Okay. And I would strongly suggest that you go, instead of saying they use language techniques, they use caesura, enjambment, and here are the lists. Now in the same order, I'm going to do the evidence. Try and take them separately. So the language techniques. So your point would be the poet uses a variety of language techniques to support the idea of conflict being distressful in their poem. For example, firstly, they use caesura in the 4th line, which I feel indicates a stop as the soldier is in the field contemplating what's around him. This makes us feel uneasy and creates an element of suspense. Perhaps he's waiting for the gunshots to go off. Secondly, so go on to our segment. Secondly, the author uses, or the poet, I keep saying author, I mean poet, uses caesura. I've done it again. Uses caesura in the middle of line 17, and you do the same thing. Okay. Sorry, I did caesura. Do it with enjambment. You know what I'm talking about. And just see what I mean. So you make your point about the different language techniques, and then you talk about each language technique separately with your evidence and what they were trying to achieve in historical context evidence. So it's kind of like a mini version of these two happen for each one of these that you mention. Okay. Excuse me. And then finally, your conclusion is how the effect on you personally of that poem, and how successful was the poet, or were the poets, if it's a comparison, in their objective. Now, just to get to the point of where you're comparing, if it's asking you to compare poems, do exactly the same system. Yeah, exactly the same list, exactly the same layout. The only difference is each time you're making a point about either saying that this particular element is the same in both poems or is different in both poems. And then what was each poet's aim or objective, or what were they trying to do to affect the reader in that situation? Okay, I hope that's clear. If it's not, chuck us a question and I will sort it out for you. So let's go to an example of this, right? So let me share my screen. Here it is. Okay. Right. So here we have my Google page. So this is, we'll get to that in a second. Let's go to here. So this is an example of an unseen paper. Remember, this is section B of your paper. And it says answer both questions. Shoulders. Okay, this is the poem. And the question is, in Shoulders, how does the poet present ideas about the importance of protecting and taking care of each other? And then finally, in both choices and Shoulders, it's given choices here, the poets present ideas about protecting and taking care of things around us. What are the similarities and or differences between the methods the poets use to present these ideas? Okay, so it's kind of the same thing. It's almost making you do one whole analysis for this one, much more in depth, and then a kind of like snapshot of this. So if you use the same list of 7, it's a nice short poem, so it'll be nice and easy for you to do. Please pay attention as well to the number of marks, yeah? This is only 8 marks. Don't kill yourself over that one when this one is worth 24 marks. Yeah, this is the one. This is the cookie you want to focus on. So looking at this and applying it to our template and our system, first thing we're going to look at is shoulders. Look at so the first thing is brainstorm shoulders. So I can only give you my personal opinion on this, and yours may be different, and that is equally valid. So shoulders. For me, shoulders, if we ignore the rest of the poem, shoulders is about shouldering responsibility, the weight of the world on your shoulders. So it's quite good to think of any like sayings or anything around the word that they use. So the weight of the world on your shoulders. I think of shoulders as being quite broad and big, and they can carry things. So yeah, that's kind of my first impression anyway of what the poet I think is trying to bring up for me in that. But that's my personal background and what I've experienced in my life. Okay. The next thing we're going to do is read it twice, honouring the punctuation and spacing. So I'm going to do that. Shoulders. A man crosses the street in rain, stepping gently, looking 2 times north and south, because his son is asleep on his shoulder. No car must splash him. No car drive too near his shadow. This man carries the world's most sensitive cargo, but he's not marked. Nowhere does his jacket say fragile, handle with care. His ear fills up with breathing. He hears the hum of a boy's dream deep inside him. We're not going to be able to live in this world if we're not willing to do what he's doing with one another. The road will only be wide. The rain will never stop falling. I'm going to go back and read it again. Shoulders. A man crosses the street in rain, stepping gently, looking 2 times north and south, because his son is asleep on his shoulder. No car must splash him. No car drive too near to his shadow. This man carries the world's most sensitive cargo, but he's not marked. Nowhere does his jacket say fragile, handle with care. His ear fills up with breathing. He hears the hum of a boy's dream deep inside him. We're not going to be able to live in this world if we're not willing to do what he's doing with one another. The road will only be wide. The rain will never stop falling. Okay. Next thing we're going to do, we're going to identify the verbs. And if that's a struggle, switch that up to vocab. Okay, so we're going to do verbs. Crosses, stepping, asleep, splash, drive, carries, marked, say, fills, hears, be, live, do, doing, be, stop. Okay, so that gives us quite an insight into what it's about. It sounds quite instructional. It sounds quite it's just looking at those words, it's quite there's lots of things you could say or think about that, and I think it's more about the impression that has on you personally. But I think for me it kind of gives a good indication as to meaning. Crosses, stepping, asleep. It's quite descriptive as to what's going on. It's describing the action, of course, because they're action words, they're verbs. It tells us a little bit of what's going on without the noise of all the other vocab and techniques and stuff like that. Certainly doesn't sound negative, but it doesn't sound particularly positive either. Okay, if you're unsure, have a look at some of the other words that stand out to you, some of the vocab they've selected. So there's rain, he's stepping gently, his son is asleep. Must is quite a tough word, quite a harsh word. The world's most sensitive cargo, that's interesting. Marked is an interesting word. Then we've got obviously the capital letters. So his ears filling up with breathing. You know, there's lots of things going on there. So we can sort of like just let that wash over you. Okay. Next, we're going to start looking at what does it look like. So very literally, what does it look like? If this was written in a different language, what does it look like? So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stanzas. Each stanza seems to be slightly different. So we've got 3 lines, 2, 4, 3, 4, 2. So we've got this kind of 3 at the top, but if we did take that away, we would have 2, 4, 3, 4, 2. So it kind of like goes one way and then goes the other way. Do you see what I mean? You've got a 2 and a 4, then you've got this middle bit, and then it kind of mirrors it with a 4 and a 2. So that tells me that this is important because it's in the middle of it. The middle of 2 bits that are kind of leading towards that, if that makes sense. The only time that I can see is any repetition in the structure is we've got a 3 line and a 3 line. We've got a 4 line and a 4 line, and we've got a 2 line and a 2 line. But it's still a little bit unpredictable. The sentence length and the line, more importantly, the line length is different in each one. You know, the first line here is short, this one's long, this one's somewhere in the middle. If we look at the other 3 liner, short, bit longer, and that's the shortest. So that's different again. So there's not a lot of predictability really. It's a little bit like some places we think we know where we're going and then it changes. So that's an interesting point. So if you come to a conclusion like that, just jot that down, a bit like the brainstorming of the shoulders. Just jot that down. Like there are some things that are the same, but you never quite know where it's going to come up. So for example, we know there are two liners, but stanza wise, but we're not quite sure where the next 2 lines, if this poem continued, we don't know where there would be another set of 2 lines like that. But when we come to it, we sort of go, oh yeah, okay, that's what happened before, but it's different again. Is there any rhyming schemes? Just look at the last words. Rain, south shoulder, him, shadow, cargo marked, fragile care, breathing dream inside him, able world doing another, wide falling. Literally no rhyming scheme whatsoever. It's freestyle, it's free verse in that sense. And remember, we go back to, does that make us feel comfortable and safe and predictable, or is it monotonous? No, because it doesn't comply with any of those kind of prerequisites. Is it unpredictable, non-rhyming? Yes, all of those things. So is it trying to make us feel nervous, excited, or unnerved, or anxious, or any of those things? Very possibly. So let's write that down. So the structure indicates that there's a feeling of unease, of anxiety. The lack of rhyme shows that it's unpredictable. We don't know what's going to come next. And we jot that down in our notes, in our template, and we're like, okay, right, I've got note of that. Don't know what that means yet, but we're going to use that. The next thing we're going to look at, so we've looked at our structure, we're next going to look at language techniques. Remember, when we come to language techniques for poetry, the first thing we want to look at, to show off a little bit, is caesura and enjambment. So let's look at the enjambment first. Where can we identify any lines that have no punctuation at the end? Well, that does, that does, that does. That does, that does, that doesn't. Okay. This man carries the world's most sensitive cargo, but he's not marked. So why is that important? Why would the author or the poet want us to recognize that? Okay. Anywhere else? No, there's punctuation there, there's punctuation there, there's punctuation there. There's not. He hears the hum of a boy's dream deep inside him. Okay. So we've got the world's most sensitive cargo and the hum of a boy's dream deep inside him. None, 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 yes. So we've got a whole stanza of enjambment here, 4 lines, and the first 3 all have enjambment that go over the next line. We're not going to be able to live in this world if we're not willing to do what he's doing with one another. So that could indicate that the poet wants us to, or wants to highlight to us, the message of this bit, or they want us to see this bit. Okay. So maybe that is the meaning of the poem. Maybe that's the most important part of the poem as far as the poet is concerned. Okay. Anywhere else? Nope, we've got punctuation, punctuation. So ask yourself, now we need to start getting into the meaning. Okay. What does it mean? We're not going to be able to live in this world if we're not willing to do what he's doing with one another. And we know from the kind of first stanza that it is literally a man crossing the street in the rain, stepping gently, looking 2 times north and south because his son is asleep on his shoulder. So is the poet literally meaning we all need to walk around with our children on our shoulders no matter how old we are? Well, I'm not being funny, but if I tried to sit on my mum's shoulders, I think she might die. So I don't think that's really what the poet is saying. Maybe they're indicating that it's a metaphor for life and how we should be looking after each other. Okay. And the reason that they've used enjambment here is to make this stanza stand out so that we, as the reader, pay more attention to it. And also, enjambment is often used to explain or elongate an idea that the poet wants us to really pay attention to, or really wants to explain to us. They want us to hear it. And that could be why. Okay. And then finally, in our essay, we go on to, well, we've done caesura and enjambment. Of course, you can identify other language techniques. You've got, vocabulary and like how they've identified certain words or used certain words. The fact that the son is asleep further supports the fact that he's vulnerable. And maybe if we're looking at this and it being about life, not just about a son and his dad, if it's about life, then it could indicate that they're trying to say that we should be taking care of our most vulnerable when they're in the most vulnerable state, maybe. We've also got, what else have we got in there? So here, this man carries the world's most sensitive cargo, but it's not marked. So is it literally the world's most sensitive cargo? No, it's an opinion, because we don't even know the boy's name. So he's not the most sensitive cargo to each and every reader, is he? Our most sensitive cargo would be our own people, our own children, or our own parents, or people we're looking after. But to each of us, we have different people. And therefore, if the writer is correct in the fact that they want us to look after each other more, if everybody looks after the people that are special to them, then surely everybody in the world ends up being looked after to a large extent, unless someone is solitary. But what they're saying is we shouldn't be solitary, and we should be looking after each other so that nobody is solitary, perhaps. Remember, you always want to suggest it, don't say it as fact. What else have we got here? We've got repetition of language here. No car, no car. Very instructional, very direct. Shows the urgency and the importance that there is no room for negotiation. It repeats again here. The road will only be wide. The rain will never stop. These are really, really strong instructions, aren't they? And very bold comments to make. And so here, I think that that indicates the fact that these are very important. But also, if we're talking about this kind of being about life, as well as this whole poem is a metaphor for life, I believe, from seeing this, that they're using, or Naomi Shihab Nye is using the analogy of the child on the shoulders of the parent and then crossing a dangerous road in the rain. It's a really difficult situation there. It's not all sunshine while they're holding their hand and it's nice and easy. It's not. It's just really tough on the parent. They've got a heavy responsibility keeping the life of that child safe while they're asleep and completely oblivious. So if we're looking at the road will only be wide and the rain will never stop falling, if that's an allusion to life, if that's an analogy for life, then it's kind of saying if the road will only be wide, the journey of life will only be wide, or a long way to get across the dangerous part, which is the road. The road is the dangerous part of life. And the rain will never stop falling. Is that an indication that the poet is saying that the rain is, is that relating to pain in life? Is there always going to be pain? Is there always going to be challenges? Or are there always going to be challenges? Speak grammatically correctly, Hayley. Are there always going to be challenges and fear and evil and all these things? Yeah, there is in life. It's always somewhere. It might not be in your particular life in that particular moment. Hopefully you don't go through your entire life going through that, but it is around everywhere. And that's the point, that life is hard for a parent because you've got to look after each other. But the reason you're doing that is because there's always stuff to protect each other from. And that's the message that I'm going to say, that Shahid Nye is trying to say, is that we always need to be looking out for each other. We always need to be looking after each other in humanity, because we're not going to be able to live in this world. They're her exact words. How do you live in this world when you're not looking after each other? And then we're going to look at the effect on me personally, or the effect on you personally. So I'm going to say, it's a bit different for me because I am actually a parent, but that's what's really important. I'm going to use my own experience and you can use your own. Maybe you're looking at it from the perspective of being the child. So I'm going to do it from my perspective, and then I'm going to give an idea for you. So I would say this poem has a profound effect on me as a parent, because I understand the responsibility that I believe Shihab Nye is attempting to create in the reader. I understand the responsibility of wanting to care for and protect my child, and get them across the dangers of life, like the danger of the road, through any pain, challenge, or upset they might endure or I might endure. And despite all of that, put that all to one side, my priority is to look after my child. If I can use that to look after everybody else in the world and everybody around me who seems vulnerable or needs help in a particular time, and if other people can also do that to me, society will be so much happier. We'll have a better sense of community. It might improve the problems we have in society with mental health. And I feel like it would be, in Shihab Nai's perspective, and certainly in mine as well, a much kinder and more loving environment to live in. Okay, so that's my effect. That's the effect of the poem on me as an individual. On you as an individual might be totally different. So to give an indication what something you might say, and it doesn't have to be this, it's just a suggestion. What comes up for you is right, as long as you can sort of say why. What, you know, why do you feel that way? So for example, you might say, I find this really easy to relate to, as the child that is protected by my parents. They're always looking out for me, and the way that they're looking after me, I want to extend that to how I look after people in my life. And I don't have to be a parent to know what it is to feel responsible for those who are more vulnerable than me. So you might say something like that. Or you might say, I find this really hard to relate to, as I don't have children myself. However, I do understand that Shihab Nai is trying to encourage us all to look after each other. And it's made me think I might be a bit more aware of doing that moving forward in my life. That's amazing. You're basically saying that the poem has made you think about how you behave in your life moving forward. That's quite a profound effect. Yeah. And then finally, just to round off, how successful do you think they were in their objectives? So you've basically said in this poem that the poet is trying to make this parent carrying a sleeping child walking across a dangerous road in the rain. They're making that a metaphor for life, and that life is dangerous, full of pain and heartache and challenges, and that we should be looking out after each other through that. And I believe they were really successful in doing that because they've used so many different techniques that might appeal to different readers in different ways, but ultimately all of them indicate the importance of protecting the vulnerable and the importance of looking after each other through our difficult life. And that's it, just again backs up everything that you've said previously. So I hope that's been useful for the unseen. Now, when it comes to your anthology, I know we've only got about 5 minutes left. The reason I haven't given loads is because you can use everything we've gone through today to apply to the poems that you've done in your anthology. So if you haven't had a particularly strong experience at school with analysing your poems, just do one poem a day. I think there are 15 poems. So in 2 weeks, just over 2 weeks, you will be able to analyze each and every one of those poems using the system that I've given you. So just going, actually, I don't want to share my screen because I want to look at this in a second, but going back to what we looked at, those 7 things, you know, brainstorm the title, read it twice, honoring the spacing and punctuation, circle the verbs. What does it look like? Looking at stanzas, rhythm, and rhyme. What's the other one? Language techniques, the effect on you personally, and the how successful the author was in doing so. And if you're looking at a poem where you're comparing, then you want to make sure that you are doing exactly the same thing, but you just talk about both at the same time. So, for example, the use of enjambment in poem A, whatever, use the title, the use of enjambment in poem A indicates that they're trying to create a lengthy idea, whereas the enjambment in poem B shows that the violence is relentless. So although both poems have used the same technique, they've done it to accomplish different objectives. Yeah, so that's what you're trying to do. Or you might say they've done the same thing in the same way, but I feel like this one was more successful because their vocabulary choice added to their objective more successfully. Yes, you're criticizing, you're being an English critic on what you're looking at. Okay, so if you can do all of that just with those 7 steps, you can do exactly that with every one of your anthology poems. Okay, and if you're stuck on any of your poems, when it comes to the Q&A tomorrow, chuck me a little message and we'll go through any of the poems that are a bit difficult for you. You don't have to know all of the poems. There's also a you can access, if you Google AQA power and conflict poetry themes, there are lots of tables of showing which, or like pictures almost, showing which poems speak about which themes. So I would suggest that you look at the minimum amount of poems that address the most amount of themes, and then that way, if you learn those ones really, 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 really well, then you're going to always have something to write on. Okay. And when it comes to here, compare how poets, so this is just a past paper, compare how poets present ideas about conflict in Bayonet Charge and the other poem from Power and Conflict, and in one other poem from Power and Conflict. Then, you know, this one about conflict, well, the whole chapter of all the books, the whole anthology, that section is all on power and conflict. So unless there's a poem that only talks about power and no conflict whatsoever, which is almost impossible, you can literally write about any poem. As long as you can make those analogies and you're comparing, then this is the same, this is different, or they're using the same technique, but they're doing it differently, or they're making the same point, but using different techniques, then you're doing exactly the right thing. And all you need are those 7 points. Brainstorm the title. That's almost read it twice. Circle the verbs. What does it look like? Language techniques, effect on you, how successful was the poet in achieving their objective? And you should be golden. And that also gives you, as I said, plenty to write about, even if you don't fully understand exactly what you think the poet was writing about. As long as you get an idea of the subject matter and the tone and what they seem to be trying to do, they're not asking you to go through every single line and understand it in a very obvious way. They're not asking you to do that. So stop trying to. That's just a waste of your time and stress. Okay. So I'm just going to stop sharing there. I'm just going to double check I've covered everything I planned to cover today. Yes, I have. Yes, I have. So, yes, that's fine. All good. So I've covered everything I wanted to. And it's 12:59. Look at that. I'm actually finishing on time for once. Okay, so if you do have any questions, like I said, we've got our Q&A session in the second hour tomorrow, for the second half of the second hour. So that's a really convoluted way of saying the last half hour of our course. Any questions you have, either on the poetry or in anything we've done, jot it down and we can chat about it tomorrow. You can either write it on the chat tomorrow, or you can speak to me, or you can put your video on. It's entirely up to you. It's whatever you're most comfortable with. Or if you want to, if you would rather message me anonymously, then get your parents to WhatsApp me and I will do the answer to the question on the call, but I won't say who has asked for it. I mean, honestly, there's no need to be embarrassed in any way as far as I'm concerned. Any question is a good question, and you might be asking what someone else is thinking. But I understand that obviously as well, it can be a bit nerve-wracking and, you know, you might be worried, but don't be, because I'm here to help. All right. And any question is a good question. Hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you for, oh my gosh, we'll have our last session tomorrow. It is a double session, so make sure you've got, you know, loads of chocolate with you, because that will obviously help. And I hope you have a lovely day. Take care, guys. Thanks for being on. Bye.